more than human worlds.
As I said, both of us have thought about the question of Zameen in different ways, but invoking Zamir is more than only the given self. It's also speaking to the moral consciousness. That's the idea that it's a conscience at work, and that we really, as having had the sovereign position as a species for centuries, and in a more well-defined, instrumentalizing kind of way for the last 300 or 400 years, it actually falls to us to give up some of that sovereignty and to exercise more the moral consciousness.
So I would begin with sharing my interest in understanding how to develop a sensibility that could enable me to recognize the difference between the ecological democracy and the representative democracies, and the similarities in the processes we see in external ecosystems and in the processes of our internal ecosystems, and how the human body has much in common with the rest of the living world.
I think the understanding that we live in an interconnected world and that we must consider all the elements, and our minds should be open. And it's difficult because we have not trained for that. Hundreds of years, no, in a separation of everything, no? Separation of science, of this is social science, this is natural science, and in natural science you have this, you have that, you have so hydrologists, geologists, climatologists, So we must open, I think, ourselves in order to integrate and incorporate everything and try to go there with a different perspective.
The first feeling I had was how there is this indigenous element in the poles, and that is the ice itself. It's an elder and it's a library. It's an archive that literally, as a material, preserves everything that is in it, but it's melting so much faster that for a long time it did its decolonial work. So in the Arctic, you have stories of how the ice, because the permafrost has melted, it's pushed up graves and revealed like colonial intent. But it's melting at such a great rate that it can't even tell those stories anymore.
This whole thing of eviction of people is not just to this museumization as you're talking about, not just that. It is also killing the agency for protection of a certain kind of conservation ethics or idea. It's killing that agency. Now, who can stand for the forests? You and me won't, because we don't bear the cost immediately, at least, and we don't own them. The people who own them, the people who bear the brunt of the cost of the roads going through the forest, they are not going to stand because they're no longer there. They're dwindled. The numbers are now, by policies and clinically sort of, cutting them away. So I feel the battle is more complex, more difficult to save this world, I feel. And there are several fires now, and if you douse one, there are so many big fires run by very big people, very powerful people. And so how do you do that?
I think one of the features one realizes over time is that the animals and humans cohabit spaces. They impact and affect each other's ways of behaving. And to put the question you asked on the head, elephants in, say, Zimbabwe, the same as caribou. No. The people are different, so are the elephants. This doesn't mean they match the human culture, but there is a continuum in this. And I think we need to come to terms with the continuum. The continuum is being broken. And the place where the continuum is frayed or broken, these conflicts become extreme. And we need to minimize those, because the continuance of these animals free-ranging in stable populations in their own societies is also very important to the larger ecological fact.
How do we engender this thinking, this move that we need to make, so that we have a different ontological perspective on the world when we have these conditions in which are so deeply embedded in how we live, in terms of the cooking practices, in terms of the eating practices, in terms of, animal care and pet practices. What can you start to do from an artistic perspective?
really a growing lexicon. So it's a suggestion of words from the contributors. Some of you are here and you've all contributed words to it. The idea that we have a new glossary of what that world will look like. So thank you, Katrina, and this is available for anybody who might want to buy it. So I think Toxic Ring is offering a discount at 600 rupees, that whole set. So it's worth buying it, I think. Thank you. So we have a small panel discussion. I invited 3 colleagues, Achia, Sonia, and Sharbendu, to talk about some of their ideas of multi-species. They all use these ideas in their own work. And I think they've all prepared a small presentation, so which should we start with the presentation, or you want to first have a conversation?
Whatever you suggest.
Presentation. So, Sonia, you want to go first? Okay. So, Sonia, we'll have a short presentation of a few minutes each. So, about 20 minutes for 3 presentations, or 22 minutes, and then...
okay, I'm audible, clearly.
So, we can sit there, Sonia, and watch you, or you want to...
No, we can continue to
you
sit
won't
here,
block?
unless we are the shadows.
We block, no? So, we sit.
Okay.
So, I'm going to be a hard time master.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to speak very briefly about 2 projects and then elaborate on my contribution to the publication while bringing up some provocations along the way. So critical membrane addresses itself to the mangrove ecologies of India's Coromandel coast, bringing together a multiplicity of impulses, observations, and responses, ranging from microscopic details of microbial cultures to documentary cinematic studies of marginalized groups whose eco-sensitive and sustainable livelihoods have suffered as a result of the decline and degradation in their environment. In her essay, Healing the Planet One Microbe at a Time, Nancy Attajania writes about the project, and I quote, "As landscape becomes scapeland, it loses its shimmer as an art historical genre and begins to tremble with the fate of other half-rhymes, such as wasteland or hinterland. It becomes striated by human greed, ecological dystopias, and very difficult to erase caste, class, and regional lines." She continues, "A series of photographs titled Universe in Details echo Blake's perennial line, to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. In this photographic series, we see images that may resemble a tree of life, a salt stain, fungus, grains of rust, a rash, a painter's palette perhaps, or even bits of intestine. What they have in common is an unsettling beauty. In the film, Moving Inwards, I make an experiential journey. In this zone, time moves very slowly, reduced to the most essential moments of breath, heartbeat, and the splash of the oar in the brackish saline waters. The work is inspired by a vision of planetary rewilding, evolution supporting lands and water, where wildlife and humans flourish together. However, the vanishing point in the film keeps shifting, disrupting the hold of a sovereign order that produces a field of containment. Being confronted with the discomfort of not arriving where we expected, how do we navigate and orientate in the challenges arising from the struggle for rewilding, biodiversity, and sustainability? The second project I'll speak briefly about is the Soil Lab, which has been supported quite extensively by Coach International Artists Association and the Wellcome Trust UK. This ongoing project examines the effects of salinity on food crops, comparing both transgenic tobacco plants modified with the genetic material from mangrove species such as the Avicennia marina and more than 20 indigenous coastal saline-tolerant rice cultivars such as Pokali, Matla, Kaksal, Nona Bokrel, and Rupsal, amongst others. Drawing data and vital information from the fields of biotechnology and microbiology, the artistic investigation speculates about a future where the transgenic becomes vital for human survival. While we become aware of the tools used to create new hybrid life forms to the role of genetic engineering, we perceive that we must work within the boundaries of ethics, biosafety, and security. Entanglement of time and tide is an engagement with the North Sea and Atlantic Ocean, its coastal ecosystems and intertidal zones. Reflecting on the human impact on our environment and in particular effects on marine wildlife and microorganisms by capital heavy industry and anthropogenic activities, this body of work is a contribution to our empathetic understanding of the oceans, their vitality and ability to support and sustain all life, and their poetic reflections in contemporary culture. In addition, the project draws to attention the impact of technological obsolescence, the drive to consumption, and the impact of waste created by these technofossils. And finally, I would like to reflect on my contribution for the Multispecies publication. And this is important because the image is also a subject, a symbol, an experience, and a process. So the starting point for the series of work is multiple field visits to the ruins of Cremond Island, a Scottish defense site from World War II. The work further investigates the potential of cohabitation and contamination for sustaining all life on Earth, whereby a parallel can be drawn to the history of the wartime site and the ongoing anthropogenic activities within the site that slowly become invaded by microbes. I ask, how do the political and economic activities come to shape the centers of our worlds, the tissues, fibers, and forms of its lands and water bodies? How is the movement of non-humans remade through these anthropogenic activities? We collected living material from various environments of these zones. Back in the laboratory, we decided to construct devices for culturing a diversity of microorganisms, reusing the collected habitat. The prepared columns were observed over several months for development of layers, smells, colors, and zones. As the microbes in the soil photosynthesize pigments, we are exposed to the processes of the growth and decomposition of various species of bacteria, such as Chlorobium, Chromatium, Pegiatoa, Desulfovibrio, as well as the potentially harmful E. coli, with variations in population observed through waves of color. What constitutes life? What do we think about using living material and life processes as a medium? What does it mean to have agency and ownership over another's life? Do we think of this lively material as a carrier, holder, or vessel? What is the role of human being as makers? What do we think about the disposal of these lively objects that soon become infectious laboratory waste? What does it mean to be at risk with each other? Anthropologist Anzi says the evolution of ourselves is already polluted by histories of encounter. Purity is not an option. Collaboration means working across difference, which leads to contamination. And finally, three provocative and thought-provoking words come to mind: multi-species sustainability, polyphonic assemblages, and interaction. The focus of sustainability on human well-being and preservation. This is the purely utilitarian perception of nature as a resource for humankind, and therefore I think it limits its conceptual and analytical power. Interaction understands the agency or the ability to act, not as an inherent property for an individual or human to be exercised, but as a dynamism of forces. And this ability to act emerges from within entangled relationships and not outside of it. Assemblages are performances of livabilities. Organisms don't have to show their human equivalence, whether as conscious agents or intentional communicators, to count. Assemblages coalesce, change, and dissolve. And this is the story. Anzi says, if a rush of trouble stories is the best way to tell about contaminated diversity, then it is time to make that rush a part of our knowledge practices. Thank you.
Sukanya, can we start from the beginning, please? Sukanya, can we start from the first slide? Thank you, Ravi. For today's brief talk, I've borrowed the title from the book Speculative Multispecies Project, the book that you've seen. And I felt it's a very strong word, Jeev Jal, as it reminds us about the web of life and the interconnectivity. But this web of life, do we still have it intact, or has it been ruptured? Admittedly, it's been severely ruptured, and so I felt it might be good to start with a provocation of looking at the epistemology of othering nature and non-human agents. Alienation of man from nature has been calamitous. But how did we get here? Cartesian dualism arrogates all intelligence and agency to the humans, with none to the non-human living beings. The biggest project of colonialism has been to introduce nature, the biggest project of colonialism has been to reduce nature to an inert force devoid of any spirit, agency, or consciousness, thus enabling unhinged extraction of resources solely meant for human consumption, but not for all humans. In today's hyper-capitalistic times, we must identify capitalocentric technocratic societies as the new colonizers. We must urgently acknowledge that extractivism is an unsustainable and thus a failed model. The Enlightenment theory propagated in the 17th and 18th century, also known as the Age of Reason, has projected man as exceptional and thus distinctly separate from the rest of the ecosystem. A closer examination of the historiography must then be read as human history, written by us humans, glorifying our exploits and exemplifying ourselves as exceptional. But would the tigers and deers, the octopus and phytoplanktons, the forests and the mushrooms, butterflies and the moths concur with this history as the absolute history? Has it ever entered our consciousness that perhaps we are incomplete and inadequate and thus fail to comprehend signs and signals from non-human agents? Now, I would like to begin with showing some of my photographic responses. Can we move to the next slide, please? An elegy for ecology, driven by these concerns around ecology and climatic situations, I conceived an elegy for ecology as a trilogy. In the first part, I refrained from regurgitating the obvious set of images of disasters, sites of mining, deforestation, etc., and instead wondered what kind of a future might we all inherit in the wake of the climate crisis. I speculated a future where estrangement from the nature has amplified loneliness, solastalgia, and eco-anxiety in an attempt to make sensorial visual articulations. Trees and animals in this series have entered private spaces, and clean oxygen has entered the commerce of human relationships, using symbolic motifs like animal-shaped inflatable pools, live animals and plants. I etched out characters trapped in their technocratic silos, living isolated, lonely, fractured lives, pining to reconnect with nature. It is here that I wish to bring in my second provocation to re-examine the role of art. Artistic responses to climate crisis in the post-colonial, post-modern 21st century has encountered a unique problem, which is of disbelief, given their propensity to feed on shock and sensationalism. A majority of these responses often weave technocratic, apocalyptic, or fantastical narratives that largely render the narratives implausible, thereby reducing them to a spectacle and othering ecological concerns. I believe that the genealogies of such ineffectual responses can broadly be traced to the canon of colonial masculine positions as opposed to ecofeminist, ecocentric ones. It is here that I must question my own positionality as a heterosexual male artist. If returning to multi-species cohabitation can help repair our estranged relationships with nature by encouraging interconnectedness and regenerative practices, then South Asia might be able to guide the path. After all, we have lived in equanimity with nature, at least used to not too long ago. Here, belief in the existence of spirit worlds parallel portals and the agency of non-human living beings is not alien. I would like to show my next response. In 2015, I went to Nepal to photograph the aftermath of the earthquakes. People were traumatized. I noticed them sleeping outdoors. I wondered, where does the mind go while the body remains static in a sleep state? I introduced the anthropomorphic form of the Nevari demon god Lakhe to symbolize violence. I think somehow over the past, I've also been fascinated by the childhood stories that I was told by my grandparents and my father. And so in 2017, I started another project which is called as The Fall of Murshid. And I'm just showing just two images from that. It is in this series that human-like spirit animals, or is it spirit animal-like human, that keep returning into the series. Let's move on to the next one. Post-humanity scholar Eduardo Kohn, Ravi quoted him in How Forests Think. He says, how other kinds of beings see us matters, that other kinds of beings see us changes things. If jaguars also represent us in ways that can matter vitally to us, then anthropology cannot limit itself just to exploring how people from different societies might happen to represent them as doing so. Such encounters with other kinds of beings force us to recognize the fact that seeing, representing, and perhaps knowing, even thinking, are not exclusively human affairs. He assists us with a bidirectional thought. Understanding the relationship between distinctly human forms of representation and these other forms is key to finding a way to practice an anthropology that does not radically separate humans from non-humans. I would like to end with my last series, Imagine Homeland, and it is through these works and provocations that these are very entangled questions that I stay engaged with. Indigenous communities comprise less than 5% of the world's population, but protect 80% of the natural biodiversity. Living symbiotically with nature, they have always been aware of the circuitous relationship between the distinctly human, non-human living beings and other invisible agentic forces. For example, the lesser-known Tibeto-Burman Lisu tribe that lives in the forests of Arunachal Pradesh, they believe that a parallel, invisible world coexists in the same time-space continuum. They call it Mamem, and the invisible humans living there as Maisa. They say that for each Lisu, there is a similar-looking Maisa in Mamem, and should one suffer or die, the same fate meets the other, alluding to the bush soul concept. Invisible portals connect both worlds, and stories of interactions with the Maisa exist in the Lisu world. Their relationship with the forest and its innumerable elements are influenced by similar belief systems, making them more respectful of nature and its cohabitants. I continue to symbolically explore man's archetypal relationships with nature and the consequences of this estrangement. Thank you.
No, I'm good. Okay, my presentation is going to be much shorter. I'm going to speak about my contribution to the publication, which in a sense is a kind of provocation or a critique or a response to the idea of post-human. So yeah, I think first of all we will see the slides, the next one. So my work is inspired by, by John Hans Arp, or Jean Arp, or Hans, depends, the French-German artist. And we can go to the next slide. This is a work that I've seen at a dentist clinic here in Delhi, and I was fascinated by the work. That's where I saw it for the first time. It was exhibited in India somewhere in the 80s or 1980s or the 1990s. So men seen by a flower. I kept this in mind, perhaps somewhere. And when I got we can go to the next one. When I got the concept note of Ravi, this is what I created. So Jean Harp's men as seen by a flower, as seen by different people, and these are the drawings. The drawings were actually taken from the internet because I would look at this sculpture in a certain way, which I would think seems more like a flower, and yet many other people took a very different perspective of it. And we can come back to this slide later on to see it. But now we can go to the text. So I will be reading this as well. The shift from humanistic or human-centric worldview to the more inclusive and planetary vision of shared ecologies is both thought-provoking and crucial. At the same time, this concept raises new questions. First and foremost, regarding representation. Since agency depends on representation, the question is who is responsible for the representation of the non-human world, or how the non-human is brought into conversation, which is by necessity or not, can we think about other ways? Which is by necessity human. My concern, in a sense, reiterates the old Marxist problem of representing the suppressed or subaltern classes, which, as Ravi's note pointedly argues, were or are treated as less than human, and like the non-human world, are exploited for their labor. The question, however, is who has the right to speak in the name of nature, or alternatively, how can one conceive of a real dialogue between nature and culture? Inclusivity in this context, this is the danger, can be another form of suppression. The next slide. Viewed from the perspective of shared ecologies, Jean Harp's Men as Seen by a Flower marks the limitation of representation. The imaginary and ironic representation of how non-human may imagine the human underlines the complexity of any such kind of endeavor. Interestingly, since this small sculpture was mass-produced and distributed to the visitors of the 1958 Universal Exhibition in Brussels, there is no canonical or official version of positioning the sculpture. It can be turned around, as I discovered. My drawings respond to this plurality and further foreground the process of representation that is entangled with any conversation. Now we can go back to the drawings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I do apologize. I forgot to introduce all three of you. And I don't even have a written, I forgot to even ask you for a written biodata, so I really am sorry for that. But most of us know them, but for those of you who don't, Achia, Sonia Mehra Chawla, and Sharbendu, they are three well-known artists, very successful artists, conceptual artists. who also, for example, Achia is a professor at the Jindal University. He heads the Fine Arts Department. And Sharbendu has been teaching at the Jamia Millia Mascom. He's been teaching photography, I think a sabbatical right now. And Sonia has done a lot of work in Scotland and in Edinburgh, and she is currently showing at the NID in Ahmedabad. And she's shown her work extensively in Berlin and in Edinburgh, in England, and supported by the British Council and the Edinburgh Culture Science Festival. So this is just from the top of my head, but they are all over the internet, so you can. But sorry about that. But thank you for these reflections and the contributions to the book. And I had suggested to ask you about some speculations, because it is a speculative exercise at the moment. And I'd just like to open it up with a question to all three of you, and however you might want to answer is. So what are the critical ideas about multi-species world which you seek to or can address as artists? Sonia?
So for me, I'd like to open this up by really talking about a couple of things, and starting with the idea of sort of messy encounters. And also, when I talk about this, I also look at the nature-culture divide, or the binary as such. The idea that if you look at the tree of life, we have always seen the humans at the top, and then the microbial ecosystem right at the bottom. And so therein lies the problem. It's this arrogance, which is a problem. So the idea of looking at these worlds from a perspective of perhaps maybe, empathy, love, but also really opening this out to look at it as ideas, or through the lens of cohabitation. Now, I think what's very interesting is within the scientific fields itself, there is now these new provocations with the landmark work of scientists such as Margaret McFall-Nye, for instance, who are talking about how various disciplines of science need to come together. But also the idea of opening this out further through the idea of how we look at perhaps our own bodies. So she goes ahead and she says that human bodies can no longer be looked at as fortresses to defend against microbial assault. And perhaps that is the first and foremost way of maybe looking at the world, and looking at the other than human or more than human, however we want to address this. But the idea that the I within us is composed of multitudes, and the idea that the I is a we, I think that is a really interesting position to begin with.
So do you see, if I may just follow up with a question, in the work you've done in laboratories, you've had residencies and worked with scientists in Europe quite a bit.
And in India, at MSSRF, quite
extensively. At the Madras Institute of
MS
Development
Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai. Yeah.
How well is this question framed in the terms you're stating it?
Yeah.
Because the question is still about inquiry from a human perspective.
Yeah.
But you're stating it in a way in which it becomes a uniform, a samtal gaze, if I may want to use the word.
I think that's a very interesting but very complex question as well. Because, if you're talking about the institutional angle and that aspect, and how an artist sort of negotiates or sort of works within this space, I do understand that there are several challenges, and I have faced these challenges, whether that is at MSSRF or with the Wellcome Trust, or whether that is at Ask Us Art and Science in Edinburgh. All institutions will always have their own agendas and things, but then I think the idea is how do we keep the the artistic passion alive and still manage to sort of say or do what you want to within that certain framework. But having said that, I think the complicated questions lie because when we talk about science, we have to look at science as an entangled whole. And by that, I specifically mean that science cannot be seen as separate from history, as separate from politics, as separate from policy. And so wherever one works, I think the things that one sees around is that at any given time, the policy or the governance at a certain point will then determine certain modes of inclusion and exclusion.
Sharbendu, would you like to respond to any of this or the question?
I mean, it's a complex question, Ravi, and I cannot claim to have the answer. So probably the first step towards engaging with the multi-species discourse is to begin with realizing and acknowledging that we don't know. And no matter how hard and how far we think, we are always going to think from the very human perspective. And what does it mean to have the human perspective? We are the body and the mind carrying centuries of colonial aggression and the sensibilities that have come from the humanities discipline. So how do we undo that? How do we unlearn all of that? So that is a major problem, and we are trying, many of us, including me, and yet the problem is people like us who live in the cities, we are far removed from nature. We are far removed from a direct connection with different non-human living elements, to have that direct conversation, to be able to learn from them, which begins with the ability to listen to them. And if we cannot do that, then it's a very problematic situation. Now, on the positive side, for example, while I was making Imagine Homeland, and let me give more illustrative examples so that it doesn't remain a very didactic conversation. So it took me, it took me 7 years to make it, and year after year, whenever I would have some money, I would go and live amongst the lisus in the forest, and it's dense forest. There are no phone, electricity, there's no sort of communication with the outside world. So the first time I went there, I went with this idea that I'm going to stay there for a few days, and I know how to photograph, I have command over the craft to some extent, I can make it. And then I made something, came back. But the stories remained with me, and soon I realized that I need to go back. And I went back. The next time I spent a whole month in the forest with the community. And then I was still trying to impose a certain sensibility. I knew I needed certain X number of portraits and X number of different kind of images. I was doing that formula-based response. So the third year, I go and spend 2 months in the forest. And these 2 months, I had no connection with anybody from outside. And then slowly certain things started to change. In the initial visits, I was asking them, do you believe in forces of nature? Do you believe or pray to the sun or earth? I was trying to allude and find out about animism. And they were like, no, we don't do that. We don't believe in that. We are civil, we are Christians now. We are civilized. That's exactly the answer that they gave me. And then one morning, somebody came and told me that it's going to rain today. And I was like, how? The sky is very clear. And they were like, I saw a fish. And I was like, what does it mean I saw a fish? And then another person, while having a conversation, said, Sharbendu, it's going to rain today. And I was like, why are you guys saying that? The sky is very clear. And he says, I saw a fish. But they wouldn't articulate it until I finally understood that they saw a fish in their dream. And until that time, they said, we don't believe in any of these things. It needs a different language. The problem was I was working with a language that I had adopted and learned from living in this environment, in this ecosystem. And then it did rain. And there are many similar experiences where over the period of months, slowly I was not looking at the phone, I was not looking at the laptop, I was just letting it go, I was walking around, I was not making images, I was just living for months over there. And slowly, images started to happen, and without trying to pretend, that there is many images that have come into the series which actually came to me in my dreams. Now one can say I constructed those in my head, or we can try to be a little more humble and say perhaps nature and the forests had its way of speaking to me, and and inserting their agency onto me through these dreams. In modern science, why are we constantly negating the power of dreams, dream symbolism, or that other elements of nature do have a voice, they have an agency, and they speak? I remember Ritik Ghatak's film Ajantrik, where there is this old taxi driver with this old rickety car taxi that he wants to dispose of, but he can't. And he's like, but the taxi has been with me for so long. And so the taxi driver sees agency in that inanimate form of the taxi. Over here we have, what is that? We have that festival where we worship industrial tools, etc. Vishwakarma. So where do these come from? We have it within us, so multi-species is not a new thing for us. We just need to go back.
If I, I mean, us is a big word, so I don't want to sort of bring that about. But if just follow up with him to deepen this, before we come to you, Achia. When you were working, went to this community, indigenous community, did you see different ideas of plants and flora and fauna than what you had probably encountered here as a certain kind of Latin classification to a different kind of story?
Well,
did they have different names? Were they described as stories or as things?
They have stories. I wouldn't be very well aware of the stories with regard to plants, but I did meet and have conversations with the doctors. They call it Netsasefa and Netsasema, which are traditional healers. So they would go into the forest at a certain time, and they would have conversations with plants. They would be very careful so that their shadow doesn't land on the herbs. And Netsasepa, the man, he told me that if my shadow or the shadow of someone else falls on the plant, then we cannot use it for medicinal purposes. So there are certain things and rituals and practices that they have. And it's very difficult for me also to completely understand all of that. So I cannot presume to say that, yeah, I understand that. But it's a very complex world, and yet it has its own beautiful rhythm. The thing is, it takes time to get a hang of their rhythm.
It's also good to hear we can all have different dreams. So I come to Achia.
I actually wanted to just respond to this with another story. Talking about histories and talking about mythologies, during the time that I was, researching at MSSRF, and I was obviously frequenting the mangrove forests in the area along the coast. And what I found very interesting is the idea of how sometimes mythologies are a way, and this whole art of storytelling is a way to keep ecosystems alive. And this I just kind of incidentally found out because there is a saying in that part of India where they say that, Shiva wanders the mangrove forests at night. And he's the protector of the forest. And therefore, it's a way of keeping the forests, in a way, pristine, clean. It's the abode of God, in a way. But also what I found very interesting is that within the grand Chidambaram temple complex, there's this small sanctum, and it's usually kept locked. It's just they open it a few times in a year, so I was very fortunate that during one of my multiple visits, I was able to really have a look at what was inside, because I'd only heard stories about it, I'd never seen it. That inside this sanctum, there is a sculpture with the image of a mangrove tree carved on it, and this is at the heart of the Chidambaram temple. And that, I think, that tells us a lot about how, the importance of this kind of storytelling that has sort of continued over these millennia, I would say.
I will respond as well. At the risk of repeating myself, I would like to present a different perspective. I think that the idea of post-human, our ability to adopt a post-human position is problematic precisely because whatever we do and whatever we see, whatever we perceive, when we are conscious or while we are sleeping, waking up, interpreting our dreams, and so on and so forth. All of this is human. All of this is coming from human agency. What art work is showing, at least in my understanding, is our inability to understand how flower is responding to us, how flower is imagining us. There is another aspect in that work, and that's the imposition. You see the world through your own eyes, your own being, whatever you are. And that's the way the flower were conceiving the human being. Now, this is not to be pessimistic. I think maybe I'm insisting on terminology. But what I think we should do is challenge what modernity dictates, the way that modernity arranges the relation between nature and culture. And for that, we need to go slightly deeper. We need to analyze our own discourse, the historicity of the way we think. How we moved from looking at the world as an enchanted place, what were the advantages, disadvantages, etc., and how we landed in the way we see the world today, which is the scientific way of seeing things, which is obviously not objective or just the right way, the only possible way. Here we have a scientific observation of someone who saw people, who saw fish in their dream, and it was raining. So this is, this is a method that goes through the dream of a person, and there is no way that it will pass through a lab, perhaps. But it does. But there is a system here, right? There is a way, a presupposition, and consequences which can be measured almost. So why we are not accepting this kind of things nowadays? And I'm not saying we need to jump to the forest and behave in a certain way, but we can definitely, and we should, because we are definitely in a crisis, as I understand from Ravi and other environmental artists all the time. We need to find different ways of thinking about our relation with nature, what is culture, and so on and so forth. So.
You chose to show a form, which is how does the flower look, see. So the role of aesthetics, and what is the limits of that representation, or that what kind of aesthetics can be? You want to comment on that?
How aesthetic can contribute to seeing this in a different way? Well, that's, thought-provoking one. I will aesthetics in that way, but not necessarily aesthetics, but art as a space for thinking and reflecting can be a lab to entertain this kind of strange ideas that you're bringing from the forest, or that you are experiencing in your scientific experiments, right? So for me, the advantage of aesthetics or of the domain of art is precisely in the fact that it's not confined to the limitation of a normal scientific discourse. So we are getting lost most of the time as artists. We are not reaching anything conclusive, and then suddenly somebody is reading our works in a certain way which brings something new into existence. I don't think it's the magic of art. I think it's the liberty that art took for itself. That's my initial response.
So I'd also like to not make it here, but open it up, and if there's any questions, and if there are none, I will ask another question. But if there are, then I give if somebody wants to ask them anything.
I have a question for Sharbendu.
Of course.
Which is that, Sharbendu, I've also had the privilege of seeing some of your drawings, meticulous drawings that you do before staging a photograph, and some notes and things like that. So I think what I'm very curious to know is that what is the role of the non-human in these, in your meticulous, meticulously staged work. And of course, the other thing is that are they actual actants in that space, or what is their role really? And it's not easy to work, when you're staging such a thing. It's not easy to work with, for instance, animals, right? So what role do they have? Are they actants? Are they not? So on and so forth.
Difficult question. They always behave the way they want to. Now, different projects have different contexts. So for example, imagine Homeland. I admit that I went with a certain mindset that I know how to do and I will do it this way. And the forest taught me otherwise. There's a different rhythm and I have to learn to be in harmony with that rhythm over there. And I'm a different human being. And then there are different responses. There are bizarre experiences I've had, including with spirit forces, which I don't usually talk about because I'm also a little nervous that how I will be perceived. But I've literally had, and there is evidence of people who were there with me who went through that experience. There was an evening when a young girl was very unwell in the village, and certain things happened in the house where I was living, and I was really worried because for months I hadn't spoken to my family members. I didn't know whether they were fine, and I started to get worried about their well-being. And I was like, finally I had to tell myself that, all right, if something has happened to my loved ones, I'll get to know it in my dream tonight. I wake up, it was fine. I knew what had happened. I knew that the child had passed away. So very early in the morning when I went to the river to fetch a bucket of water, I spoke to someone, the child had passed away. Now, so what I'm trying to say is the aesthetics of my work with the drawing, etc., it all starts sometimes. It's not a formula, it's always a dream-based response. I live in the cities, I don't get dreams. I wake up, I don't even remember what I saw in my dream or whether even I had a dream. So that's one aspect of how it happens. And then comes in the whole craft. You know, we know how to, okay, so I've seen something like this in my dream. So then I start making a sketch, I write a note, and then I try to do, and then I go looking for a location, and then there is an instinct. Is that location speaking to me? So one aspect is that. The other about the non-human actors responding, I'll again share a brief anecdote. So while I was working on an elegy for ecology, on the final sets, in the final days, there was one image of the lonely man where we had a live duck, a swan. So my team members went and found a swan finally at a farm in Greater Noida. And like, finally we got a swan. And so the swan was brought to my studio space and was left in one of the rooms. And everybody was very worried as to how do we get the swan to get inside the pool. And so they were trying to direct the swan in this way and that way. And then I said, don't do that. We need to give the swan the time to adapt to this space. The swan has its own, and then we were waiting. There was a whole crew over there, and with a big crew, there's also the matter of billing. But then we had to wait, and eventually the swan went into the pool, claimed its territory, we got the shot. But that's something I believe that we have to wait for them to respond, and it works out. So it doesn't have to rigidly fit into my diagrams. The diagram is only a sketchwork meant to take us in that direction. The idea is not to make an image exactly the way I had imagined or conceptualized. The idea is, does this image evoke a feeling or say something? That's the best we can arrive at.
There's always that space for sort of improvisation and
always.
for experiment.
Always. You work with live animals. You can't dominate how you want it. It's just not happening.
You can't dominate the microorganisms either.
Absolutely not.
All you can do is to just build what you have to and just hope that they'll show up
as we know from the coronavirus.
As we know from the virus, but also from those the objects or the lively objects that I worked with, and that's why I call this the whole idea of like messy encounters, because these are things that at least with my practice most of the time it's fluid and it's organic and we just don't know what to expect. So I think that space is very important, that space that speaks for itself also.
Should I put somebody on the spot? I see some very prominent artists sitting here, many of them.
I want to actually, I mean, maybe I'm asking too many questions, but I was very, very curious to know about Babu's work.
I haven't. She's put you on the spot. Babu.
No, I mean, because we're just having an informal conversation here, Babu. If you'd like to say something about your piece, I think it's called Dwelling. Yeah, so would you, I mean, the image is just very striking and I thought very, very powerful, you know.
No, actually, next to my house, there is a huge agricultural campus inside the city in Bangalore. So every day I go for a walk in the morning. So almost 1.5 hours I spend time inside the campus. And it is actually a very different, inside the city you feel like there is a lot of things, don't feel like city. So I used to have a small camera that was earlier like a 5 megapixel aim and shoot kind of thing. So every day I used to see a lot of anthills. So I started capturing, and there are some few because I was watching every day it's growing also. So then there was one anthill was actually, there is a fencing in the, to make a separate from the road, and because these plots were also given to the students to experiment things. So the fencing was inside the anthill. So then I did, actually I built up like almost like thousands of anthill photographs with this small thing. And then I did a few photo collage kind of few prints. So, and also in later when I started doing my own feature film in Kannada, so my first shot was started with the anthill thing. So, and also there was a huge thing was building in the background. So these are like some thousands of flats in one place. So then later in the same campus, so road was built for the public. So that was actually kind of illegal thing. So they always used to cut thousands of trees in the weekend, and they made a road. So there was a protest and everything, but nobody could stop it also. So this, the contrast in the soil.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's that.
So
stark contrast, you know, between.
Yeah. So there are a lot of this small ants and different kind of, lot of small things were there, like in the forest, what we see like rabbit or something. But it slowly started disappearing. So this was like a kind of my own.
So is the image a collage?
It's a collage.
Yeah, okay.
Anybody else? Sujit, yes. Please. No, you had your hand up.
I'm just thinking, it's reminding me of a book I had found when we started talking about how to imagine a multi-species world. So this book is called A Book of Barely Imagined Beings by an author called Caspar Henderson, which is sort of a response to another book called Book of Imaginary Beings by Borges. So like Book of Imaginary Beings was a book of mythical creatures, but this one is formulated in a way, it also consists some philosophical texts like quotations, but it's compiled in a way which to me as a reader who is not like exposed to a lot of different biological creatures, at first I thought it's a book of mythical creatures. And slowly I discovered that all those creatures that are illustrated in the book are actually they exist, and that's why it says barely imagined beings, because maybe to a biologist or somebody who works or lives close to nature, for them it will be a book of real things. But so I mean that was one way of dealing with multi-species, where humans cannot imagine that there are so many species exist. So just like a comment.
Especially in the wild, and more so in the ocean.
But also in the everyday, what lives in the soil, for example. So it's also our resolution, which makes us not see them.
I very recently learned that, less than 20%, something around maybe 15 or 16% of microorganisms in the world are even culturable. And that's how less we really know about microbial life.
Sujit, what's your experience in working on the land, since you run a farm as an artist?
Hello, yes. Actually, I was thinking of that multispecies. When we look at a cauliflower, it doesn't look like a single flower as from Darwin's book. And after reading that, I started thinking how bees are bringing pollens from different flowers. They don't know they are sitting on a cauliflower and going to another cauliflower. They are sitting on some other flower, maybe on a brinjal flower, maybe on a tomato flower, and then they go to another flower. So always when we are thinking of hybrid, it is almost like we are large hybrid entity we are living here. So, but when we are thinking in city like things, when cities are building, so many species are getting extinct. But in last 5 years, I witnessed around my farm, a lot of jackals suddenly grew, and now that is a large amount now, and that's why I have to keep more like dogs in my farm for my cattle and goats. So it is very surprising why jackals came to that area.
Jackals are increasing.
Yes, a large amount.
And you have no explanation for it?
No, actually I'm trying to search. In night I try to visit around the areas, but with my dogs, but I have less dog. So I can't target, like how can I track them? So I can see the eyes, and now I can count the eyes, how many eyes now. So like stars, you can see lot of jackals are there. So it is very surprising why they are growing.
Your farm is just next to the city,
Yes.
It's around Delhi, yes.
And mangoes are also.
Yeah.
Mangoes are growing and jackals are growing. So it's very surprising why they are growing.
They're asking where is your farm?
Near Ghaziabad. Yes.
And maybe you can tell them how you came about, why you're doing that farm. You rented that space?
Yes.
For what purpose?
Actually, I was trying to work with live colors. So what could be a live color? So then I thought all living beings are live color, and I wanted to work with them. So very first I started from CTR Studio Residency. We started a project. I started a project, my experiment with notions of dust.
Which Sarai had done.
Yes. From there I started thinking of dust and color and what is liability in that color. And before that I used to paint with oil and acrylic colors. And I thought when I am drawing a tree, it is not growing. And always it is waiting for me again when I will come back and touch it again. So then I started thinking how if we will put a seed inside a soil, automatically soil will grow it. So there is, like we are talking, there are a lot of entities who are helping a seed to grow. It is not the seed who is growing. So that's how I started growing plants. And then because rooftop is very small, we can't do a lot of things on a rooftop. So like your work, when you were talking about microbial activity and the salt experiment, I was doing that on my rooftop. I brought some urea and put it on dew on rooftop, and they started growing in like crystal form. So a nice crystal. So it became a flower-like things. So I mixed with small, like with fish bone and urea and other organic matters with urea.
Eggshells.
Yes.
You could use eggshells.
How do they work actually? But still, I'm thinking back, when we are working with scientific elements, sometimes it limits us. And because we are from art background, we have certain liberty to think illogically, and we can imagine it another way.
I think you can be in that space and still think illogically and still experiment. I've been doing that a lot, or at least trying to do that.
Yes.
And you could actually grow what you call a microbial garden in your backyard, for instance, if you want to observe. We could have a talk about that later, and I could also just help you do something like that if you wish.
Yes, actually,
you should go and visit his farm. It's quite
actually, when I was working on peat sessions, during that session, I found many layers, and every layer has its own holes.
You see the layers of colors,
Yes.
and very often, of course, then you don't always need to culture it to see. And if you have the facility to culture it, you'd know exactly which species is growing. But if you don't have that facility, you could also sense, get a feel of it from the layers of the smells, the zones, and the colors that they begin to form. But of course, this takes a long time. And there are various environmental, various stochastic processes that also depend, that would inform how these gardens would grow. So there are multiple factors, but it's worth trying out, I think.
Yes, actually, that's peat is created by every rain, and we can read every rain from a peat layer, and it's a whole rain history of last year, and every rain brings lot of seeds with it, and also every seed. Actually, I call them migrant seeds. Because they come from another space to another space, and they grow there, and they struggle with the native seeds, and that is very romantic to see how new seed is struggling to grow itself in a alien space, as we call it. But Earth has no alien space. Everyone has shared with, everyone has a right to grow everywhere.
Earth has no alien space. That's quotable. Arun?
Thank you.
Arun Kumar? Earth has no alien space is part of what you do at the Sara Center. Before we wind up, would you like to say some things?
See, my engagement with small alien space, that is where I was born and brought up. So it's a family, the small land with forest and farm. It belongs to our family. So there I'm just, just observing and looking the wonders of nature a little deeply. So one example is that how beautiful thing it is to, let's say, 250 types of rice that we have just grown. How different they are each, from each other, and things like that. And also we have about 40-45 types of bamboo and various other plants that we are just letting them grow and just watching them. How they come up. So I'm just watching.
Do you document all of this?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Anybody else wants to? Shuddha, do you want to say something? No, but you also contributed to the book, so if you'd like to.
Okay, we contributed an image of a fly, and it's a fly I'm very fond of. And I was thinking about the fly actually when Sharbendu was speaking, because you spoke about how we have become distant from nature, and about Descartes and Cartesian sort of separations. I found that fly on the wall of a house in which Descartes lived. Yeah. And it's an important moment because the Cartesian coordinates that we learn in school, the x and y axis, actually date back to the time that Descartes spent in that house. And if one reads his memoirs or other people's memoirs of him, it's about a sleepless night in which he's kept awake by a fly. And the fly finally lands on the roof and walks in a straight line, which makes Descartes think about the straight line of the axis. So, I mean, I was reminded of it because I think that this question of a multi-species exchange or conversation, I don't know, and I agree with Achia when you pose the problem of can there be a multi-species consciousness? I don't know. Except for the fact that we are actually multi-species entities ourselves, yeah, exactly. Right? And there are lots of other life forms in the hotel that we are. They're checked in sometimes even before born. They will check out after we die, and we don't know. For instance, I'm quite interested in very primordial experiences like hunger, because who is hungry? I mean, is the Homo sapien hungry, or are the microbes hungry, or is a combination of the microbes and the Homo sapiens and the other animals that live on us? Who are we feeding? Things like that. But that said, so I think of the... Huh? Who am I? Yeah, I mean, the Bible says it nicely. We are a legion. I am a legion. No? But I was also thinking about your invocation of the Nisi people saying that now they're Christian. Is that correct? The Nisu people, yes. So the Old Testament actually has 3 speaking animals. So it's not as if the Judeo-Christian tradition abandoned the consciousness of animals. And there's one very nice speaking donkey called Balaam's ass who warns people. It's in the book of Numbers. That aside, so this question of a multi-species exchange or conversation goes, in my understanding, to the very heart of aesthetic practices. The beginnings of art are about human beings trying to represent other forms of life. If you look at prehistoric art, they begin to emerge in that coalition of beings gradually. So I think that the human understanding of being separate from animals is something that took maybe 100,000 years. So the time that we know ourselves as separate is less than the time that we know ourselves as not separate, right? And that exists in our consciousness. So when we think of ourselves as separated from animals, that's in conflict with the way in which we think we're not separated from plants and animals. I think these two things are fighting in ourselves, right?
That's also because of the social conditioning.
Because of, yeah, exactly. And I mean also the fact that there are several extremely successful life forms that have taken advantage of who we are. I don't think that without human beings, pigs or sheep or some kinds of fish would have been so successful in an evolutionary scale. Dogs, right? I mean, the jackals and the dogs controversy. So this question of the relationship between us and other species, within us, outside us, around us, in our memories, is at the very heart of trying to represent anything. So it's the first understanding is of yourself as an animal, and then of other animals, and then of other humans who are also animals, and so on.
This also kind of reminds me about the, the jellyfish phenomena, absolutely extremely, and a result of anthropogenic activity in the oceans, and now it's a huge menace.
Yeah, they are the beneficiaries of global warming. So to come back to Achia's question, there is always a risk that we tend to abstract and anthropomorphize. When we think of, oh, nature is. So it presumes our custodian function at some level, which to an extent may be true, but it may be also a limited function in time. But it also presumes this understanding that we are not nature, which I'd argue we're not, we are.
Gigi? Ravi, can I quickly add? Shudha, it's a very interesting point you made. And it reminded me of a paper that I had read when I was studying photography in London about 12, 13 years back. I have never been able to find that paper again. That paper basically spoke about, it was an academic analysis of the consequences of man's estrangement from nature, especially in the urban context. And it said that we were always meant to be a part of nature, and we were meant to cohabit. And so deep down in our embryos, we have that innate need to stay connected. And because that connection has been severed, especially in the urban context, we in our houses bring in these terrace gardens. If not, we bring in pictures and calendars of scenic elements of earth and trees and forests and water, river and all of that. Or the colors. Yes, and you know, many a times it's the basic. We have to find a way back to the basics. Why can't it be simple? Something my father always used to tell me, that it is very easy to be happy. It is very simple to be happy, but very difficult to be simple. And I thought it's a very pedantic, why is he saying this boring, it doesn't seem deeply prophetic. But he kept on telling this to me years after years after years, and I think in the last 5-7 years I've started to understand why he's telling this to me. It is very simple to be happy, but very difficult to be simple.
Wait till the you becomes the bionic you. So then the you will change.
But there's, if I may say one thing, I mean, what I'm really excited about and happy about, and I think that what all of you are doing is part of that, is that this attention to, let's say, questions of the biome, of how we inhabit biology, is also in some ways a very welcome escape or departure from the way in which art has become a means of constantly complaining about ourselves, right? So I see a lot of art which is all about like, oh, the world is terrible to me and my identity is very important. I mean, when we enter into conversations with other species, your identity doesn't really matter. And that, to me, is a very, I mean, culturally, that's a way step forward in our time. Sorry?
It's expansive.
Yeah, it's exactly.
Gigi? And then Devesh is going to call on you for a while. You better be prepared.
Well, I have exactly the same what Shudha was telling about, you know, I don't see separated. I mean, of course, we are all separated from nature in that sense, but not distinctly different, and so that we have to think, to incorporate nature for...
I may ask you, you bring a lot of class and human power structures into your relationship to urban scapes, to water, etc. How do you relate that to the idea of the power structure within human to the idea of multi-species?
Well, that's precisely the point that, you know, that the moment we start, that comes with the power structure, and we cannot escape it at any moment while we think and speak. So it is a tough task that, you know, even Achia was talking about the flower's point of view of human being, you know, but that's a very interesting imagination, that what others would, I mean, other species kind of, you know, imagine us to be like. I mean, how do we actually even think about that? You know, there's something which beyond my comprehension, but we can think because we have imagination. So that I think this between spaces of artistic, artistic spaces in which, you know, we can have these cross conversations, but may not have any legitimate, understanding from the scientific point of view as the way we understand what science is. But I think, it is the way we actually start making things, and that is where the aesthetic comes in. And how do we separate the making part from the aesthetics? Or how do you separate from your feeling of looking at something and reacting into it from the mode of how do you produce it? So I think this construction part is something which is very, very intentional, and whether we can avoid it or not, because many of the expressions are all about how to be the way things are, the way we observe them, the way we silently absorb situations and let the swan goes into where it has to. But are we just, even that weight itself is an intentional act, that we are actually have certain time limit framed, whether he should or she should, otherwise we'll have to look for something else, we'll have to pack up. So, you know, so it's not something which is not very clearly flowing in the way we think it is flowing. So, I mean, it's going back to the act of intention very deeply. And I really don't know how we come out of it. That's
Devashish, any reflections?
Hello. No, I will just mention a small incident because, how nature responds to us. We have a small terrace garden, and which my wife and I water every day, sometimes twice in peak summer. Now, and one Mali comes every Sunday. So, one day he just said कि साहब आपके यहाँ एक बहुत बड़ा छत्ता हो गया है. There's a beehive, and it has bit me, one of them. I said, really, I haven't seen them. Where are they? So I just went, and we just discovered it is a pretty big size. And so I said, but I cross this area every day. He said, but वो आपको पहचानते हैं. They know you because they seeing you from the day one. And this is not the only ones. Each Sunday he came and he stopped coming because they bit him. And I told him once, let me go absolutely close to them. And I went absolutely and stood there, and they did nothing. So this is how they respond to you. Actually, because they said, because the flower they go to, and I water them every day, so they are seeing the entire process. And one more thing, what Sharbendu was saying, that I'm not a very religious person, or I'm not one of those. But I remember when my ma was very unwell, extremely unwell. She has delirium, and she was kind of losing completely. And she is from Benares, and so she said that absolutely very last month, when she was alive, she said, I was traveling to Benares. He said, can you go to Benares and go to one particular temple and just request that, I want to go now. I said, I can't do that. He said, can you do that for me? So I went to that particular temple, and I just said that, release her, because maybe she's extremely unwell and suffering, and she doesn't want to live anymore. And I still remember it was 22nd of September 2019, and she was absolutely healthy. She had no problem, except she was just losing weight, and she was and the disease would whatever do. She lost her completely. She had no memories, nothing. She would only recognize me. Not even my brother, not even my sisters, anybody. And I came back, and within a few days, she slipped into coma, and exactly next 20 seconds, she passed away. So I don't know what is this. I have no answer to these things, but sometimes these do happen.
Okay, unless...
plant intelligence, animal intelligence. And it's our own perception of the natural order of things itself. I mean, we do communicate in so many ways with our surroundings, with the non-humans and the more than humans. And we're communicating with our microorganisms, which are within our bodies every single minute of the day, even while we are sleeping. And they're responsible for our health. They're responsible for our well-being. And my gastroenterologist would always say that keep your microbes happy and you'll be happy. And obviously, there is a reason for that. They're also responsible for activities in the brain, for instance. I mean, we do have to consider all of these things as well.
So as I was saying in the beginning, I said about Edward Cohen's text on forests. And this text is actually from a talk he gave at the Sydney University, where he quotes his own book. It's about framing of how human thought is framed and how do we think in other ways. So with that sort of, I would like to, unless there's somebody trying to ask a question, and I know we have gone way beyond time, but I would like to thank everybody for this fantastic evening. more of which we're having after post-COVID. And thank you all for coming in person. It's so lovely to not to do this on Zoom. These 21 conversations, you see they have poor resolution because they're all done in Zoom cameras. And Zoom cameras are 72, resolution. And some by 360, you could see. And so it's really nice to not think of resolution when we are interacting body to body. So thank you very much to the Goethe-Institut for hosting us as well and for being part of it. Yay.